Hello, I'm Brad.
And I'm Jason.
You are listening to Dice and Mind, a monthly podcast in which we explore the meaning of life through the lens of RPGs.
We're lifelong friends, a couple of guys in their 40s who along the way had families and became professionals. Over the years, we've talked about pretty much everything. But recently, we realized we both had an interest and some history with tabletop role-playing games. So,
In each episode, we will consider everyday stuff like science, religion, philosophy, and economics, all through the lens of a specific role-playing game and its dice mechanic. For example, what would I have to roll in the Edge of the Empire narrative dice system to get that promotion at work?
or would getting that paper published give me advantage on a subsequent D20 roll in Dungeons & Dragons?
If I were DM, likely not. But join us now and every month to think deeply, geek out, and explore how RPGs make the world just a little bit better.
This is
Dice in Mind.
So, folks, today is going to be probably the preeminent and most important episode we've had thus far. Not that any were, not important, but we've talked for a couple podcast episodes about Star Trek, about the mechanics, about the game, even about the prior games a little bit. Now we're going to be wrapping that up, and we're going to be talking today about economics, science, philosophy, faith, in relation to the Star Trek universe. And honestly, from a, how does this relate? Well, this is one of the, Jason and I always do a little prep work before we do this, just literally moments of kind of talking, because this is very organic. We have been talking Trek for a long time, and it was really the onus for us to start doing this podcast. Jason, for many other reasons, has been living Trek for even longer, just in terms of the depth of it over the past 6 to 12 months. That's a story for the other day. But the point being is that we are really deep into Trek. This episode may go a little long, so rather than split it in two, use your podcast player of choice, whether it's Apple Podcasts or whatever it is. Stop where you're done and hit play again if you need to split it up. Rather than have two separate episodes, we are going to probably make some sort of mega episode today. So batten down the hatches and hold on. So, Jason, we've talked about Star Trek. Obviously, we just got done even before you hit record talking about how it was really kind of the fuel that fired the engine for this podcast. From my perspective, we have different angles to come at it from. We have some different, just because of our backgrounds and everything, we look at things, we're very similar, but we come at it from different angles. What's your perspective, just thinking about, what's your initial thoughts after us going through the two prior episodes on Star Trek? What comes to mind first for you?
It's a good question. There's so much that comes to mind, Brad. I think one of the first things that comes to mind is that almost 60 years after the original series premiered, we are today entering a true golden age of Trek, which is remarkable for any television show or television show and spin-offs. I think my girls, which just is amazing to me, my girls, my daughters, they love watching Friends. And I think of, you and I and the rest of the guys and the rest of our group, we watched that from college into like early grad school. And, that was us kind of growing into adulthood, more or less. We can debate that later. But then you had spin-offs like Joey, which was so unfortunate. That's the way of most spin-offs. And then you have Trek, and you have this growing empire of just incredible value. And I guess so. I guess for me, the first thing that comes to mind, at least now as we record, is we are entering a golden age of multiple shows where, for the most part, they're really hitting it. Where the writing is, we each have our own tastes around Trek, but the writing for at least some of the shows is some of the best out there, where the effects are incredible. I don't know how many of our listeners know this, probably a lot of them, but because of the pandemic, Trek, at least Discovery, has begun shooting in a volume, you can't see my air quotes, the same technology as used on The Mandalorian. And so the potential of what that means then for shooting, for filming, it now becomes, like with The Mandalorian, unlimited. So I just think we're in an incredible time. I mean, I'm grateful for a lot of things these days. I really am. One of those things on my list is the inordinate amount of good Trek out there. What about you? What jumps for you?
First of all, you've much like the Star Wars Christmas special, one of those shows that I think people have forgotten would be Joey. Until you brought that up, I totally forgot that he had his own spinoff. That lasted about 3 or 4 episodes before it went off the air. I've always been, you and I have known each other 30 years. The listeners know that. I've mentioned it. You've mentioned it. We, in effect, we kind of bonded over watching the first six Trek movies, and TNG as a series before Generations came out.
And countless discussions about DS9.
Oh,
Oh my
and
God.
and DS9 is the one, we have, like you said, we all have our favorites and everything. For some reason, not even for some reason, DS9 obviously was maligned in many ways when it was broadcasting. They came out with, in effect, a documentary. Jace, what was the name of the documentary that they did for DS9?
What was it? What We Left Behind?
Yes,
Something like that. It was excellent.
yes. It was a great retrospective on DS9. For me, it took the idea of faith and Star Trek in a direction that hadn't gone before, and we'll get to that. And faith has always fascinated me, but ultimately, I think when we started planning this, the one thing I couldn't get out of my head was just wanting to talk about the complexity of DS9. And then as I broadened it, as I started thinking and kind of note taking about this, how much depth there is to of all of the series, including the original, which I think some people forget. But the science and economics of it, even if we start talking about economics, because I know you just mentioned this before, and then I want to get your opinion on it. This idea of, I'm going to steal your terminology here from our earlier discussion, future colonialism, and how that was an underlying tone to the original series. Go boldly, go where no man has gone before.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I'm going to segue because I want us to get there, but I don't want it to be too much of a downer, because we're just calling out, what was. I think that's absolutely right, Brad. That the original series is so dated. I think, and forgive me, listeners, I don't remember the name of the episodes. I typically haven't done that. But in the episode of TOS with the Organians, the Enterprise has been sent, if you recall, to essentially rescue, to render assistance, but to rescue the Organians, because in the Klingon Federation War, I was going to say the first, but now we know from Discovery that's not true, retcon or otherwise. The Klingons, the Klingon front was approaching, and the Organians were at risk of being taken over as a planet, as a society, as a culture. And so Kirk and Spock and the others were sent, in essence, to rescue them. And the Organians kept refusing. Now, spoiler alert, it turns out that, in fact, the Organians were beings of pure energy and were just fine and had only assumed a corporeal form for the benefit of the lowly mortals and errant Vulcan on the Enterprise. But the point was, and I think where you're going with this, Brad, is there's at the end of the episode, Kirk says something like, sometimes I forget that we're not the most advanced species in the galaxy. And that I think, listeners, was endemic to the 60s. Think about what was happening in the States in the 60s in terms of the Apollo program, in terms of the Cold War, etc. Okay, so clearly the original show had a colonial, or at least a settlement mentality in retrospect. I think another way to look at this, or part of how to look at this, if we really just imagine ourselves in Trek right now, is that TOS began from Roddenberry's vision of a future utopian society in which the ills of humankind were largely no more. And Roddenberry kept, as we understand it to be, a fairly firm grip on that fundamental philosophy for the show. Between TOS and TNG, however, we can see there was a switch, part of it brought on by technology, right? Better, what was that? The old Dow Chemical ad, better living through technology, or maybe that was better living through chemicals. Whatever it was. By TNG, we see that the Federation, as an ersatz humanity, has become not so much a utopia, but this enlightened post-scarcity society. Enlightened in the best sense of what happened in 1700s, early 1800s Earth, of a society that was evolving based on reason balanced with compassion. Yes, there were all kinds of problems during the Enlightenment, but in Trek, we take the best of that. Reason and compassion. We talked about this last episode. And then also post-scarcity. Once you have unlimited energy, and then you have replicators, you can have anything. And so by TNG, and then coming back, like with Brad with DS9, where, okay, now we're coming out of this enlightened post-scarcity society, but we're on Terek Nor, and things are different, and suddenly everyone on board has to have laudanum. Then things start to get more real. But I'm going to stop there and turn it over to you, because I know you've got some very, very definite thoughts about DS9 and those other aspects of the show.
Yeah, I put a pin in this because I think you just hit on a very important point. And if you look at our modern economy, and I just watched a movie about our recession in 2008, 2009. And ultimately, our economy is driven on credit and commerce. I'm oversimplifying. Well, like you said, if every person can, in effect, produce what they need when they need it, and there is unlimited energy to do it, to use your those are the two focal pieces, I believe, that obviously, drove that enlightenment. And we saw some of that in First Contact toward the end of the film. For me, like you said, there is still economics in Trek. It's very different, and it's underlying in many ways. There's obviously trading, because there are some things that obviously replicators can't replicate something they don't know. Items, food items, and so on can be replicated, but they aren't 100%, what a real thing is. So there's obviously economics to it, but DS9 broke ground because it the Klingons obviously had Kahless as a deity. The Bajorans had, in effect, the prophets as deities. It was kind of a polytheistic religion, but it hit on religion, and I felt like religion and faith, maybe a better word is faith, maybe I shouldn't use religion, faith conflicted with science in multiple episodes. They took that on full bore. I could think of, and I'm not going to remember the episodes where, one of the episodes is where Vedic Wynn tries to close Keiko O'Brien's school because Keiko is teaching them as wormhole aliens, and Wynn wanted them taught as prophets. So you saw science and faith go head to head. I'm a firm believer. There's a lot going around these days where people think that they are exclusive. I believe science and faith can, should, and do coexist. And I think DS9 started tackling that in 1993, 94, 95. I can't remember what season that episode was in. But whereas everything up to that point, there was talk of it. Obviously, Klingons had Kahless, but they didn't tackle it as a focal point of the series, and they did that. And I think that's what attracted me most to DS9 is DS9 broke ground even further than the other series have. I mean, go back to the original series, and you just talked about it. We're not the only beings in the universe. Well, we could just say that here on Earth based off of what's been going on today. I think there was even a component of that. I think we both know there was a component to that to the original series. There was an interracial kiss that caused consternation amongst folks who were not progressive in their thinking at that time. Every series did it in some form or another. It almost pushed society ahead. DS9 had its first same-sex kiss with Terry Farrell as Dax. So sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but we talked about this before. There's like we talked about, we're organic, and there's just so many thoughts flowing through my head in terms of the dichotomies of those different areas of faith and science, and then the economics of it, and even the faith and, again, I'm kind of quoting you here, the deep spiritual philosophy of the Vulcans. That Trek is very different than Star Wars in that way. Star Wars was really about, it was a space opera. That's what George Lucas made it to be. Roddenberry took the Flash Gordon space of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s and put a real, I don't know the best word, humanistic spin on it, maybe is the right word. I don't know. I'm sorry. I think we both talked about this. There's just so much that we can go into. I'm trying to focus on it right now, but there's, once we open the floodgates of this episode,
So let's go with it, and maybe we can do it in this direction for now. Because I think you've set it up really well. So let's talk about science and faith in Star Trek. Obviously, Star Trek has always been predicated on the philosophical assumption. I say that intentionally, right? It's a deep philosophical assumption that the way to progress is science. And what I mean by that is a fairly savvy sense of this, right? Like I regularly teach my students, science isn't a thing. Science is a way of thinking about the cosmos. It's a method, right? Whether you say science or scientific method, doesn't matter. Whether you want to call someone a natural philosopher, you want to go old school, great. It's a way of asking questions and testing the truth of those questions with the capital T. None of this postmodern silliness. That's not what science is about. It's the assumption, the philosophical assumption, straight out of the Enlightenment, that the more we know about the cosmos around us and in which we exist, the more we know about ourselves and one another. And the more honest we are about it, the better we can all become as individuals, as societies.
Let me ask you, because I think I like the way you're going on this. So I absolutely agree on the role that science plays, and how it will, how it, like you said, it's not a thing. But what has been, you know, we have obviously, not only did we bond on Trek, but we bonded on discussions around religions and faith, our own and others. You know, how did you feel when they introduced this idea of faith in a deeper way in DS9 than they had in prior series, TNG, and
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
after that, a little bit Voyager.
Yeah. Yeah. They had me at hello. They really did.
Really,
Because
I
no, because religion isn't a thing either, right? It's another way to know the universe and our place in it. It is less concerned with truth as discovered, more concerned with truth as given. I find that inherently limiting, but it's not inherently antagonistic. Like you said something earlier, and it got me thinking. Um, outside, I'm going to make a bit of a blanket statement, listeners, but I think it's a fairly conservative and accurate one. Outside of more traditional Christian and Islamic thought, most cultures and most religions, certainly organized religions, do not struggle with any implicit difficulty between scientific and faith-based thinking about self, other, world. They are different ways to know things, and I think Gould was wrong in calling them non-overlapping magisteria, right? That's just saying, well, these two things are never commensurate. That's not good enough. That's cheating. You said that essentially earlier, Brad, in this episode. One of the things I so fell in love with about DS9 was, I think, the same thing as you did, that here you had a Federation officer, or just Federation officers, period, and Federation civilians daily interacting with a community who tended to be deeply and beautifully religious. And then to help tell the story and stress that these aren't stories that can be neatly wrapped up in, whatever the 52 minutes of the 90s shows, whatever it was, they made the Star Trek commander and then captain a prophet. I mean, that's just damn good storytelling. But it's because of all of that that I think it was such an interesting storyline. Like in terms of DS9 being the first serialized Trek of any kind, and then trying to constantly balance science, technology, faith, community, the things you said earlier, Brad. I will always be a TNG guy, I'm sure, although, man, Picard is giving it a run for its money. But like you and I have talked about, I still think that the last few seasons of DS9 are easily some of the strongest Trek ever written and performed, and in large part because of how they forced us to look at that dialectic of science, faith, and how you can find beauty and reason in both of them.
Yeah, and TNG. I mean, obviously, in many ways, the original series, and even good parts, and we could debate this if we want, were episodic. They were self-contained episodes. DS9 started that way, and then you saw a shift. You saw a shift when they introduced the Dominion. They had little, like with the Locutus season finale and then season premiere, when Picard was assimilated. That attracted my attention because that was serialized Trek, and I didn't realize that's what attracted me to it. DS9 was serialized, so you saw you saw the growth in the episodic TNG period too, but it was just so much more magnified. It was so visual to me as it grew. But I want to jump back. I could deep dive on that forever. One of the things that you and I used to talk about a lot was how faith and science and culture can coexist, be together, or be separate. There's a lot of, there's a lot out there where people can identify with a culture but not a faith, or people identify with a faith at the expense of a culture. People can identify with a culture and a faith. And I think just based off of our histories and who we are, we talked so much about that. And I want to get off the faith thing because I could do this forever. But just this idea of culture being a complement, or faith being a complement to culture. Culture is a complement to faith, however you want to look at it. DS9 took that in a different direction. But getting back to the economics of it, DS9 hit up economics because obviously they were on the edge of the Gamma Quadrant, area of the universe that they had not yet explored. So you had a deeper introduction of the Ferengi and their existence, where economics was their deity. It just mishmashed so much together, but they had the luxury of having the original series and TNG, and even to some extent in the last of it, right at the end, Voyager. They took a lot of ideas. So I don't want to dwell on DS9 because DS9 was built upon the foundation that was TNG and the original series and the films. But I come back to this idea you just mentioned when you said culture. It flipped a switch on me. So many cultures in this. I mean, that's an understatement. For those of you that are Trek fans, you're probably rolling your eyes saying, "Yeah, we know." But this idea of how cultures interact, how the economics change or are different, how their interaction with others. I can remember a DS9 episode where they were humanoid, but they had lighter gravity, so she was forced into a wheelchair because she couldn't function in the air quote heavier gravity of it. And obviously TNG had introductions to all sorts of species that later series were able to take advantage of.
This is so excellent. Been chopping at the bit to go here. Let's stick with culture because I don't think we need to leave that. And I'm going to take a page, since you were talking about the Ferengi, I'm going to take a page from Mugi's book, not the Rules of Acquisition, and indulge me here, everybody. Let's try to define what we're talking about and try to characterize Trek by way of comparison, because I just, in my mind, I don't know any other better way to do this. So let's go back to Star Wars for a sec, because you brought that up a couple times this episode. If we look at the culture, the mythos of Star Wars, by the time we get to Star Wars, or as my daughters know it, A New Hope, or as my daughters know it, why is everything so old? Anyways, by the time we get to Star Wars, like in story, there has been hyperspace travel for 20,000 years. Okay, no matter what research we read, the Western Hemisphere almost certainly hasn't even been colonized for that long. Maybe 16 to 18,000 years, but not 20,000 years. And so you go to Star Wars, and for 20,000 years, the galaxy has been connected. And so we see essentially a galactic civilization. And of course, there are lots of cultures, but largely a galactic society. When I was a kid, Brad, you and I were talking about this right before we started recording too. But when I was a kid, I just assumed that it was the same in Star Trek. Not, of course, the 20,000 years. In fact, I've always just assumed that Trek is approximately 1 to as many as 2 centuries early in terms of the storyline. Like, I fully expect we'll pretty much get everywhere we see in Trek, minus transporters. I think other than that, we probably are going to get to the rest. Regardless, it wasn't honestly more than a few years ago, maybe only 2 or 3, that it finally grokked for me. Wait a minute. We live in a big galaxy, but in Trek, only a smidgen of it has been explored. Yeah, with Voyager, like you said, Brad, we go to the far expanse of the Delta Quadrant, courtesy of the wormhole. At Bajor, we go to the Gamma Quadrant. And of course, most of the action in Trek takes place in the Alpha and somewhat in the Beta Quadrant. But in fact, if we go to canon, known space is only an approximate sphere of about 1,500 light years. Now, I'll bring this to a closure in a sec, because then I really want you to jump in here, my friend. But one of the things I struggled with, even as a teen and young adult, was you watch like TNG or whatever, and it's like, okay, come on, how many species can there possibly be? How many cultures can there possibly be? We'll ignore the fact that they all are humanoid and how they retcon that in a really clever episode. I want to say that was the Kelvins, but don't quote me. I might be way off on that. Anyways, let's just look at action. Oh, you have it?
Was it the episode where they were
They were searching for the DNA traces with
Yes.
Picard's professor.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah,
Yep.
so good. We'll also ignore the fact that the progenitors looked a lot like the founders from DS9. But hey, you know what? When you have a good idea, you run with it. Okay, so let's talk some actual research, because it's Trek and it's science, people. Let's look at this notion. There are within let's say, let's take it. I'm sorry, I'm being inarticulate. Let's take Earth. Let's put it in a 25 light year diameter bubble. Imagine a sphere that's 12.5 light years distant in all directions. Actually, why not? Let's just go out to the full 25. We're being crazy anyways. Within 25 light years of Earth right now today, there are just, to the best of our knowledge, there are just shy of 400 stellar systems, 400 star systems. If we go out in real life, 1,500 light years in every direction, so like what we have in Trek, there are 7 to 8 or more million star systems. Now, let's ignore the famous Drake equation from 1961, because that was just a thought experiment. If you're not familiar with the Drake equation, Google it, DRAKE. It's just a way to wrap our minds around what's the likelihood of galactic civilizations, right, who aren't us. Let's just ignore it and keep it super simple. 1,500 light year radius around us. Let's say 7 to 8 million worlds. Let's say that 1 out of 1,000 of the, 7 to 8 million stars. Let's say that a mere 1 out of every 1,000 star systems has life, even at the cellular level. Okay, so now we're down to a mere 7 to 8 1,000 systems. And I'm just going to gamble here. Let's say that 1 out of every 10 of them develops sentient life. See where I'm going with this, guys? And so the notion that we could be awash in a galaxy of intelligence. I'm not sure we have a lot of that down here, but that's not the point. We might be awash in a galaxy of intelligent species. That really could happen. And I'll wrap it up this way. And Brad, I thank you for indulging this rant. So I don't know if you and I have actually ever talked about this. I don't know that I've ever said this to anyone other than maybe my wife and my children when they were too young to know or care what I was talking about, which actually still might be today, but we'll see. I have assumed since as long as I could look up and stargaze that the universe, certainly the galaxy, was full of life, and that there was no way we could be alone. As Ellie Arroway, the protagonist in Contact, my favorite movie, said, or her dad said, to paraphrase, if that's the case, what a waste. What a waste of space, literally and figuratively. What if Star Trek is real, in the sense of what if we are citizens in a galaxy of untold countless cultures, of philosophies, of sciences, of faiths? I have assumed, and here's the part I don't think you and I have ever talked about, my friend. Maybe we have. I have assumed since as long as I can remember that this was so. And anytime I've thought about, man, how must other people around the world think about this, which I do a lot, I've always then questioned, okay, but what about people on other planets in other star systems? And so I think culture is super relevant, Brad, to the philosophy and the storyline underlying all of Trek. If we have thousands of living languages on our little planet right now, and we have that many distinct and semi-distinct cultures, then how much more rich are the ideas and the ways of exploring the universe and the ways of believing in the universe across the myriad systems? Thank you. That's my TED Talk.
Okay. I have to believe we've talked about this, but nothing comes to mind because you've opened the door. When I was on mute while you were talking, I was hearing it, and then I was hearing it, and then I was feeling it. And I mean that in the sense that this is a huge topic for those of faith in many ways. From a Christian, I'll just say from a purely Christian perspective, can a God exist that created everything, and there be, are we like you said in Contact, are we the only species that he created? I mean, are we, let me rephrase that. Are we the only planet that he created in the vastness of space? Do we have all the information? There's so much that is unknown. And science can help us determine that and help us with that from a faith perspective. And this is where I struggle at times with friends who like me, have a belief system. I believe that, and I won't get into the details of it, but you open the door, so I'm going to kind of dab at it a little. Yes, absolutely. There's a richness of culture. If let's play the hypothetical game, if people don't want to believe it, I can't imagine you'd be listening to this podcast this far in if you didn't believe it. But to those that don't, just as Christian belief says that God created the heavens and the earth, the universe, could God not be a universal being in some form or another? Different cultures might identify it differently. Even here on Earth, cultures identify it differently. One could argue if it's the same God or a different God or whatever the case is. But this has always fascinated me, just because, as someone who has done a fair share of research and study, and I think I'd like to be able to say I have a you know a deep faith in my belief system. I cannot be someone who says that we are the only ones. We don't know. Trek gives us a ability to play that out. And I know people, this is the other interesting thing. I know people who are active Christians, pastors, preachers, researchers, whatever the case is, that are huge fans of Trek, because it doesn't take God away, it just enriches the question.
And
I
that's
don't.
what I
Yeah,
was
go
just going
ahead.
to say. I'm sorry, I was just going to interject. And
Yeah,
that's what made the storyline in DS9 so provocative and what's the word I'm looking for? So just so engaging, so thought provoking.
yeah. I just think that there are groups of people out there that cannot reconcile that. I was talking to. I don't want to get too deep in this, but ultimately, in certain areas of Christianity, there is a belief of the sovereignty of God and all-knowing God. He knows things that we don't know. He is infinitely wise. What's wrong with looking at this from a scientific perspective? Trek broached that, and I don't think we're at a stage in society. It almost feels like, again, I'm going to get political here, that we've regressed in a way, but there are groups out there called like Biologos and all that believe that science and faith can coexist. And Trek gave us an example of it. Yes, it's a story, but I think it is a deeply, potentially, revealing story about what could be. So, I won't get into this now. This can be for those of you that follow us on social media, send a message, because I'd love to talk about this, but I can't. This will be a 4-hour episode.
Yeah,
I don't think, and I'll turn it to you. I don't think that. I think there's a lot more out there that can watch Trek and be enriched by it, that also have a faith, whatever faith that is, not just Christianity, and be able to have that coexist and be able to, in their head, reconcile it with the mysteries of God and the universe.
yeah, I think there's so much to talk about there, like you said, some of which I would just actively push back against. But I think whereas bring it back really to Trek, like you were saying, whereas Roddenberry was, I mean, just avowed anti-religion. Uh, the later Treks became so much more nuanced. And I think one of the things that I really came to appreciate, especially these days, is how, well, on the one, there's not this assumption that people are believers. Two, that there is the assumption that in the Federation, everyone is expected to think for themselves. And three, that especially like with DS9 and some of the others, that there was a clear effort to refute the traditional Christian hegemony that we see in the States. I was going to say in Europe as well, but really in the States, this notion that religion is not Christianity and vice versa, that it is a global and multifaceted phenomenon. And so, and then it's just really good writing and really creative thinking. And so you look at like the Bajorans and you look at their faith, and to me, we see this fascinating amalgam of Catholicism and Buddhism. Honestly, kind of reminiscent of Frank Herbert's Dune series, especially in the early books, and how, however many millennia in the future that's supposed to occur, that you had things like the Zen Sunni and all these fascinating ideas of, let's take what we're familiar with when it comes to organized or not religion and faith, and now let's look at it differently, beyond preconceptions, with the notion that there isn't any single core, that there isn't any single right with a capital R. And I think Trek has done that fairly well. And you and I've talked about this, but with Discovery, with season 2, they had said point blank, we're going to get into some issues of faith and whatnot, and they completely dropped the ball. I really enjoyed the season, but they really dropped the ball on that, and they could have done something around that with Pike. Maybe they will do some of that with Picard. With and spoiler alert, if somehow you're actually listening to our podcast and you've not seen Picard, you should pause it now and check in a few minutes. But with Picard becoming a synth, right, an android, ultimately it raises the question of identity and what it means to be a person, what it means to be real. And man, if that's not the point at which science and faith overlap, I don't know what possibly is.
Oh, I was like a kid that had just been told he can get a cookie from the jar. For our listeners here, you'll hear some differences in perspective on this. And that's what drove. You are now inside the conversations. Not that you haven't been before, but now you're really deeply inside the philosophical conversations that Jason and I have had.
Welcome to college. The
now.
year is 1992.
Yeah, exactly. This is October of 1992.
Tuesday nights.
Although
Monday
it's
nights.
Much more.
Was it Monday or Tuesday nights?
Tuesday nights.
Tuesday nights.
Tuesday nights.
Starting when? 10 p.m.
I want to 10 p.m. Yep.
10 p.m. every Tuesday, 4. You might say religiously, gave us time to finish our homework. Early nights would wrap around 12. Most would wrap around 2.
Yeah, and let's just for the record say that it allowed you to finish your homework.
Still, those conversations, my friend, were one of the best parts of my entire higher education.
I left the college where we met after a year. That could have just literally, I could have disconnected, or we all could have disconnected and gone our own ways. Because we had only been in school together a year, and I wouldn't have met you all, you and the others within our group. We call it Coffee Talk on Facebook. I wouldn't have met you all, and even after that, there was a connection, and we have continued it to this day. Even when it almost, you could have almost flipped a coin and said, okay, are they going to stay connected or not? It was 50-50. So. Yes, we have. I mean, Jason and I grew up with some different culture and some different ideas of faith and some, honestly, different ideas of science. And I personally am richer for the fact that we had those discussions. And I did hear different perspectives. I did hear even things that at the time I disagreed with. And maybe now I might, in some ways, not stuff we've talked about here, but in some areas we'll disagree on things. But that idea that we could have these debates and be civil about it and learn from each other. I learned more that year than any other years it took me to finish my undergrad. And it wasn't because of classroom. And I Instagram me or Facebook me and I'll post about it, because that's another topic and I'll go down a rabbit hole on that. But I think it was playing out Trek in a very small way. Learning from, perspectives that we hadn't thought of before. I'm speaking for me specifically, just because I grew up in an environment that was I wasn't exposed to the culture and everything that I was exposed to at college. And let's be honest, folks, it was a college in a small town, and the college was around 800 kids or 800 students. And I learned so much just in that environment of 800 students in that little town.
I remember as a frosh one night going to sleep, probably at some geriatrically early time of night, but still I remember thinking, wow, I am friends with people I never would have been friends with before I got to college, and how cool that
Yep.
was.
Yeah. I mean, all of us even in our expanded group, because Jace, your brother, went to a different university and we met people through there. We would go to a restaurant later in the evenings down in our town, and it would be all of us have different perspectives, different beliefs, and different cultures.
Jewish,
And
Muslim, Christian, all
yep,
hanging out together, all arguing about the same stuff, all having a great time. Because
great time.
that is the future that is promised by Trek.
Bingo. You hit it right on the head. And those, I mean, we've all had a lot, we've all had some very important moments and periods in our life. When we got married, our kids, each day our kids grow older, it's an important moment. But those were defining moments of the person I am now, as much as education has been. Just learning from each other and disagreeing, but still laughing when we disagree. You know, it was the most diverse group that even now I'd ever been involved with. And we still, for the most part, all of us still communicate and still talk. And we are wrapped around the country and around the world. So,
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
I just, there's, we probably, this obviously will be a longer episode, but I feel like we've only hit about 1% of what we wanted to talk about.
Well, and that's the beauty. That's the beauty of Trek. I mean, again, listeners, we appreciate you indulging us. I mean, Brad's really right when he said earlier in the episode that this conversation we're having right now was one of the primary reasons we wanted to start this podcast. And so, rest assured, after this episode, we will be leaving Trek as a topic of focus for a while. Rest assured, like with the other games and the other topics and the other storylines, will be coming back. But this one is a big one for us, and we don't think we are alone. Again, there's a golden age of Trek right now, and there could only be such a renaissance, or as Patrick Stewart once said in just the absolutely kitschy show he was on, I'm blocking on the name, a renaissance, right? There could only be that if there were a real serious interest among how many millions and millions and millions of viewers. And this is what Trek does, right? I still might want to be a Jedi when I grow up, but I can watch Trek. Brad can watch Trek. We can talk about Trek, and we can see a glimmer of what could be or what ought to be. Man, there's just so much. Brad, where do you want to go from here?
Yeah, I don't know how long this could be a 4-hour episode, but Trek, this is a little self-serving by continuing on this, but Trek was the first fiber that bound us to those discussions. I don't think we wouldn't have randomly come up and started talking about this stuff without having, and I can't even remember the situation. I think in your dorm room, I think someone had a Trek movie on and I came in. And that's how it started in some ways. But that happening, that happening spurred discussion, and that discussion broadened and broadened and broadened. That's what they wanted. That's what I truly believe that's what they were hoping for, was this idea of, for those brief moments when we would sit in the room and discuss things, there was these moments of utopia. Maybe I'm over dramatizing it a bit.
No, but I think one does not need to be cerebral to enjoy Trek, but one can be big time cerebral and enjoy Trek even more. And you and I have always have always geeked out about that. Like, one of the reasons I was so, I mean, I don't get excited easily, but one of the reasons I was so excited for Patrek today, for Patrek, oh wow, must be past my bedtime, for Picard to debut, and they still haven't answered my question, is I just want to know, what are the geopolitics of the galaxy? I just want to know in season 2, what's going on with the rebuilt Cardassian Union. Have they had a resurgence and flourishing of art and literature? Are they working with the Ferengis? And on and on and on. But that's my point, and I think that's why it's so
You
akin.
could step beyond that, because not only do we want to know what's happening in the 25th century, now Discovery
Oh,
jumps us
32nd
even further
century.
ahead.
Do you know how many times
Yeah,
I have tried to zoom into the screenshot of their map? Sorry.
yeah. We've talked about this, but just the idea. I think in one of the episodes, I think we both caught it, that there was a Cardassian wearing a Federation uniform
There
on
was a
Discovery.
Borg child in the far future classroom from Lower Decks.
See,
Love it.
so yeah, so we have two eras, Picard and Discovery, where they're building canon for us as we speak. I'm looking down at my Star Trek Adventures material over by my bookshelf. I've run out of space, so it's embarrassingly sitting in a stack next to where I have to find space for it. But
For shame. For
yes,
shame.
I know. But there's no material over there that, other than, there's no material over there for 25th century Picard and 32nd century Discovery. Folks, this is a great time to be someone who enjoys Star Trek, a Trek
Oh,
fan,
oh
or
yeah.
someone, again, you could be a Christian and ask those questions you were talking about before. When you think about it, 6 to 8 thousand potentially different cultures, I think is the number. Maybe I forget now. Like you said, it's a little late for us. But, you know, does that make faith less important? No. No, not at all. We too are examples of that. We come from different angles on things,
Yeah.
but it's enriching. I don't know what the clock is telling you.
I'm thinking we should wander over to the GM corner.
Okay, gotcha. That's what I was kind of
Yeah.
alluding to.
Yeah, perfect. Cause yeah, I thought so. Cause something you said, so I've got something, if you don't mind if I start. Uh
No, go ahead.
so let's see. This episode is scheduled to drop in early July. Happy Independence Day, everybody, if you're in the States. Hope you had a nice long weekend. Uh I so we Brad and I have talked about, our bookshelves for RPGs before. And in fact, I think Brad, you called me out in the first of these 3 Trek episodes about how, ever since before we've even known each other, uh before I was buying any kind of Star Trek RPG book, and I have very few, I was buying the official books, typically from Simon and Schuster. The tech manuals and the encyclopedias and the compendia, etc. Well, if you guys aren't familiar with this, um, Eagle Moss, who makes all those beautiful collector's models, and I'll be honest, I don't get into any of that. I'm not a collector of anything. My wife would say I'm a collector of books, but I don't see that as the same thing, because I read them, I don't play with them. But Eagle Moss also has published a growing list of what's called the Star Trek Shipyards books. And I think, Brad, you brought this up last ep. What I discovered just in the past week is, so there are 2 Star Trek Shipyards Starships of the Federation books. There's a third one of civilian vessels, there and related species. Then there are a couple of the Delta Quadrants coming out, and there's a Klingon one. Anyways, I've just got the 2 Star Trek Shipyards Starfleet Starships books, because the goal of Eagle Moss, and this blows my mind, the goal of Eagle Moss is, in these books, to catalog with imagery every starship ever seen in canon, which blows the mind. However, these first two Federation Starship books, they are wonderful. Well, I discovered about a week ago that on August 17, yay verily, of this year, they are releasing an updated second volume. The first volume is like through TOS, I believe. The second, in terms of chronology, the second volume is like TNG onward. They're releasing it to include all of the ships from Picard and from the 32nd century in Discovery. It's very much a please take my money situation. So that's my Trek bit relevant to the GM corner, because Brad and I have been teasing that before much longer, we want to build what we think a Star Trek RPG could be. Brad, that's been sneaking up on me now that a fairly substantial writing project is for the time coming to an end. I'm looking over at that, shall we say, modern day GURPS manual. Anyways, that second edition of the second book is coming out, and you can assume we'll be talking about that before long. Over to you, my friend. What do you have for the corner?
So I'll take a right turn, and I was on vacation the end of last week into early this week, so at the time of recording, that will be long over, but I had a couple days off where I didn't really do anything. But while I was gone, I've mentioned this in a prior episode, my first edition AD&D books arrived.
So cool.
DMG, Player's Guide, Monster Manual, and Unearthed Arcana. So I have the collector's version of the second edition, the dark green bound books. And I took those upstairs, and I've been kind of reading through them simultaneously because I want to get a feel. Like I told you, like I mentioned before, I've played Red Box D&D a little bit when I was very, in 12, 13, and then I didn't really do it. I didn't do it at all in high school. I knew people who did, but I never played. And I didn't really start playing any RPG until a couple of years into you and I meeting. At any length. I played a tactical RPG board game called Starfire. If you want to look that up, folks. Very cool system. I got it well too young. I was not prepared for, and it really required two people, so I kind of back engineered it to allow myself to play it as a single player. But that was really the extent of it. But first edition and second edition has fascinated me. I haven't even gotten to third edition, and I've kind of held off on that because we're gonna get into the idea of 33.5 and then Pathfinder in future episodes. So we'll take a step away from Star Trek and move in the direction we've been talking about. The other thing, to your point, is the idea of building our own Star Trek RPG. This is something I mentioned to Jason. We've been noodling on it. We've tried to determine what to do with it. But as I sit here, I have the Fate core rulebook staring me in the face. I haven't started it yet. I've read through it briefly, or I've read through it at a higher level in the past. But I wanted to, and we've talked about Fate. I want to investigate that further. And so probably over the coming week between AD&D 1 and 2 and Fate, that's going to keep me busy.
And let's face it, Genesis is going to show up in that debate as well. But it does bring to mind, listeners, you can rest assured we will be getting to Fate and some of its toolkits before long.
Yeah, and like you said, Genesis, we're going to spin back around to the FFG RPG du jour, and then we're going to come back around to the D&D universe, including both the D&D versions and the derivative that spun off Pathfinder.
Yeah. We have a lot of content coming your way. We're really, really excited about it. The geekery will continue.
It will continue. Spread the word, folks. Spread the word. We are on social media. We have a Dice in Mind Facebook page. We have a Dice in Mind Instagram account. We do have the diceinmind.com website that we are continuing to iterate and build. Obviously, you have the podcast. Share the page, like the page. Sorry, this is a little self-serving. We do have an episode up that was recorded where Jace, you interviewed our friend Brian.
Yep.
I have an episode that I'll be recording probably over the next 2 weeks with a friend that we talked about in the prior episode. There is so much material coming. We do want to even hear feedback from folks.
Please.
We really love to hear feedback.
Yeah.
You know, I was just going to say, and then I'm going to turn it over to you to wrap.
No, sorry.
You know, much like you've heard Jason and I talk tonight and have civil discussions on what we agree and what we disagree with. That's what we want to hear from you. You know, if you disagree on something, let's have a discussion. Great.
Yeah.
You know, I love that.
Yeah. Yeah. Brad means it. We both do. We really want to hear from you. And I don't think it's self-serving at all. I think we want Dice in Mind to make it. We want Dice in Mind to become known among those who are interested and share some of our passions. And so the best thing you can do for us, guys, is to subscribe, to follow our Facebook page. We have been we're really gearing up, trying to post things far beyond our mere podcast, but things that we think are interesting, things that we think you will find interesting, about not just role playing, but all the other topics we explore through these wonderful games and their canons and their lores. And please spread the word. We'll have more updates on some of the other things that we're respectively doing, and we'll post those to our social media feeds. But subscribe, follow us on Facebook, tell your friends, even if they don't want to listen, just have them subscribe. It's free and it's fun. Seriously though, be well, everyone. Thanks as always for tuning in. Stay safe, stay happy, and we will see you next episode.